Today we're going to talk about my journey, and I have a story about this journey that I've been on for the last 7, 8, or 9 years, something like that, and I'd like to share it with you. So I'm Alan Medsker. I've been a member here at St. Simon's for about 27 years, and I live here in Arlington Heights. This is my Twitter bio. I'm a nuclear energy advocate. I'm an eco-modernist. You can ask me about that later. I'm a year-round cyclist. I'm a choral singer, and I'm a two-commandment Christian. And maybe my word cloud will tell you a little bit more. So, there's a stupid in there somewhere, which always refers to energy markets. If you follow my Twitter, you'll see that. So, I grew up the son of a Presbyterian pastor. Here's one of the 5 churches that my father served at while we were growing up. Not all at once. We heard the gospel every Sunday. After graduating from high school, I moved to Chicago for college, and upon graduating from college, I began my career as an electrical engineer in the northwest suburbs here. I began attending a Presbyterian church near here, where I met my wife, Carol, and we were married in 1984. A few months after our wedding, we moved to Massachusetts, and there were no Presbyterian churches in town. So we joined the local Episcopal congregation there and never looked back. Surprisingly, it was during this time that I was the most heavily influenced by, well, let's call it the evangelical wing of our faith. There were some spirited discussions. I was involved in there, some of which I distinctly recall being on the wrong side of. So through all of this, though, I continued to learn and grow and came to appreciate that a core part of the gospel, as summarized in the 2 great commandments, was Jesus telling us to love each other and showing us how. My interpretation of this is that we are all loved and that we should be taking care of each other and all of God's creation. And we should be making good use of the gifts that God has given us. Fast forward 20 years. We had moved back to Illinois, and our 2 boys were graduated from high school. And one day, one of them sent me a link to this video. I won't play the video here because it's a bit long for the presentation, but I would encourage you to view it later when you get a chance, and there'll be a reference to it on the sheet that you get. In this video, the presenter spoke of a remarkable energy source, which, if used with the right type of machine, could produce clean and plentiful energy using minute amounts of a common element that is easily mined and requires no processing. The element he was talking about was my favorite element, thorium. Named by its Norwegian discoverer after the god of thunder, thorium is about as common as lead and is found everywhere in the Earth's crust. And most importantly here, it can be used as fuel for a nuclear reactor. But this is not just any reactor. This was a molten salt reactor, which used liquid fuel instead of the solid fuel that I had heard about. And the speaker, Kirk Sorensen, former NASA engineer, talked about many advantages that this design had over the current fleet of nuclear reactors. This reactor was meltdown proof. Since the fuel was normally already melted, if something went wrong, say all the power went out, a passive system would cause the molten fuel to drain into tanks, spreading it out, and it would harmlessly cool and solidify. Since this reactor ran at much higher temperatures than today's reactors, it was much more efficient, providing more energy from the same fuel. It would also make it possible to use the heat directly for industrial processes, even while simultaneously generating electricity. But here's the line that caught me. Here's Kirk Sorensen.
In 2007, we used 5 billion tons of coal, 31 billion barrels of oil, and 5 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, along with 65,000 tons of uranium to produce the world's energy. With thorium, we could do the same thing with 7,000 tons of thorium that could be mined at a single site.
He's saying that a year's worth of all the world's energy could be provided by just a few thousand tons of thorium. This type of reactor, Sorensen said, had already been built and tested for thousands of operating hours at Oak Ridge National Labs in Tennessee back in the 1960s and 70s. While the world was building many of the reactors that are still running today, Oak Ridge was working on the next generation improved design. Unfortunately, politics and budget realities intervened and the project was halted, and the scientists, engineers, and technicians went out to other projects to solve other problems. With thousands of operating hours logged, though, the concepts had been proven. Reams of data existed in paper notebooks kept by the researchers and technicians. And more recently, this information was being digitized and put online. And I, along with the rest of the world, was learning about this long, obscure work that held such promise. Someone just had to pick it up and finish the job, and we could all gain from the incredible benefits of this remarkable technology. I was sold. I started watching every YouTube video I could find on the subject. I talked to lots of people, including many on online discussions, where I got a chance to hang out with some really smart people that knew a lot about these types of things. And I joined the Thorium Energy Alliance, started attending their annual conferences, and learned a lot about nuclear energy and thorium. I joined the American Nuclear Society. I took an online college course twice, during which I learned about the nuclear plants that are running today, all over the world. But also around this time, I began to learn about global warming. Every year, we humans dump over 35 gigatons of CO2, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. Most of that comes from burning stuff. The rate at which we emit CO2 has been accelerating, as you can see by the steep curve here. And if you look carefully, you can see that just the rate at which we've been adding CO2 to the atmosphere has increased by a factor of 7 in my lifetime. And if it's not clear, I was born in the 50s. If you look, looking at this data was sobering for me. Equally so was what I was learning about the likely effects of the resulting unchecked increases in the Earth's temperature. Rising sea levels, mass migrations, droughts and floods resulting from huge weather pattern changes, and all of this and more meant lots of pain and strife for millions of people, disproportionately on the world's poor. Even more concerning to me was learning about global warming's evil twin, ocean acidification, which has a potential to trigger mass extinction of ocean species. It did not seem to me that we were taking very good care of God's creation. Lots of other people had these concerns also. Environmentalists everywhere were raising the alarm. I've always thought of myself as an environmentalist, and one of the things that means to me is that we should be able to enjoy our natural spaces without wrecking them. And as a member of the Sierra Club, I knew that they were working hard to draw attention to our global climate problem and to reduce our CO2 emissions, which were continuing to make the problem worse each and every day. Through all of this, I continued to read and listen and learn about the many peaceful uses of our friend the atom. Some things that I learned were not new to me, but other things were a little surprising. Perhaps some of these things will be surprising to you also. During normal operation, nuclear plants don't emit anything. Nuclear energy is clean. No CO2, no particulates, none of the nasty byproducts of combustion, nothing except the water vapor that you see coming out of the top of the cooling tower. It's not steam, it's not radioactive, it's just water vapor. In fact, when studies are done comparing the emissions of nuclear plants to other energy sources, the only operational emissions that can be attributed to the nuclear plant during operation are those produced by the regular testing of diesel backup generators and the cars driven by the employees going there to work. The actual energy generation process simply doesn't put anything into the environment. Ah, you might say. But the waste is dangerous and we don't know how to deal with it. Yes, the waste is dangerous. Of course it's dangerous. The used nuclear fuel in the pool shown at the right, there's one of these pools in every nuclear reactor building that we have. It's recently been removed from the reactor core and is very, very radioactive. These used fuel assemblies, which might look like the image on the left, are initially stored in this type of pool because the water shields the people and machinery from the radiation, and it keeps it cool as well. If you were to pull a fresh one out and give it a hug because you love nuclear energy so much, the assembly would not reciprocate and you would die. Because used fuel is dangerous from a nuclear reactor, it's handled carefully, it's tracked completely, and it's monitored continuously. It stays in the spent fuel pools until it cools off a bit, and after a few years it is moved to big barrels that continue to protect it and shield the surrounding area. These dry casks, as they're called, are robust and well secured, but it's not dangerous to be near them. Weighing over 100 tons, it would be hard to steal one. But wait, everyone knows that the material inside these barrels needs to be kept out of the environment for tens of thousands of years, right? Surely these dry casks won't last that long. And of course that's true. These dry casks, robust as they are, won't last more than maybe 100 years. And we could replace them, moving the used fuel assemblies to new casks. But that doesn't seem like a sustainable practice for anywhere near long enough. I had these thoughts as well. But one day I had the following thought. What if the assumption that this material will stay radioactive and dangerous for tens of thousands of years is not a good assumption? What if we could transform it somehow into something less problematic? Well, here's some good news. There is a way to do this by using it as fuel again. Based on work done at Idaho National Labs, the GE Hitachi PRISM nuclear plant design can run on the spent nuclear fuel we already have, generating clean electricity with the leftovers only requiring secure storage for 300 years or less and being much smaller in volume. Once we decide to do so, we could build as many prisms as needed to do the job, and each of these could replace coal and gas burning power plants. Turns out, today's nuclear plants only use a very small fraction of the energy in their fuel before it must be removed from the reactor. This new reactor, PRISM, and others like it, could get up to 100 times the energy out of these used fuel bundles as was originally harvested. It's only waste if you waste it. The PRISM is a reactor design referred to as a sodium-cooled fast reactor, which was developed and demonstrated in the 1980s, again at Idaho National Labs, as part of the Integrated Fast Reactor, or IFR, project. That project, too, was canceled for political reasons, but the work was carried on by others, one of which is GT Hitachi, the producer of the video we just saw. The story of the IFR is told in this book, written by one of the two people that ran the program. It's also available as a free PDF online. This was fascinating to me. While I was convinced that Yucca Mountain, that infamous half-finished repository for used nuclear fuel, I was convinced that that was well-researched and would be a safe place to put this stuff. It made no sense to me that we would want to just discard it. Let's use it to retire coal plants. In fact, I made up my own acronym to describe the spent fuel assemblies that still contained all this energy. Barely used fission fuel, or BUF. I got varied responses online when I did this. Another thing I found out is that energy from nuclear is reliable. This is particularly important on the electric grid because we depend so heavily on electricity. When the power goes out, it's a big deal. Nuclear power plants have, over the years, been improved and optimized to the point where they typically run for well over 90% of the time. And unplanned outages are quite rare. While this chart is from 2015, the latest numbers from 2018 show that the U.S. nuclear fleet had an average uptime referred to as capacity factor of 92.6%. I learned that nuclear energy has a very small land footprint compared to other clean energy sources. An online friend of mine made this poster, which illustrates the stark contrast between the land requirements for the Topaz utility-scale solar facility in California to the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, also in California. This image shows the two facilities at the same scale next to each other. Note that the Diablo Canyon image includes the nature preserve that surrounds the actual generating facilities there, which are inside the green box. But this is not really a fair comparison because if you read the fine print, you can see that you need 14 of these solar plants to generate the same energy as that one nuclear plant. So I fixed it for him. Here's the nuclear plant. And here are the solar plants that I would need to build for the same amount of energy. I learned that nuclear energy requires much less material to be mined and extracted per unit of energy generated compared to any other clean energy source. To me, this applied directly to my own concept of creation care. Less extraction meant less incursion into nature. It also meant less potential exploitation of children and indigenous people. One thing that surprised me was that nuclear energy can be deployed rapidly if it has the right support from government and people. In terms of reducing emissions, nuclear has historically been able to do that faster than any other technology we have. In fact, France was able to decarbonize their electricity sector in 15 years, starting in 1974, by replacing their oil-fired plants with nuclear plants, which continue today to keep their CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour among the lowest in the world. France is also the largest net exporter of electricity, which nets some 3 billion euros every year. I learned that while upfront capital costs are high for nuclear power plants, they're big projects. Over time, their cost is quite competitive because they last a long time, and compared to other clean energy sources, they do pretty well. One of the important factors here is that nuclear plant is typically designed to last at least 60 years. So your upfront costs, even though they seem high, go a long way. What you get is an energy cost that's not only competitive, but also stable and predictable. I learned that we're not going to run out of nuclear fuel. As we've seen, new designs of reactors can use the significant stores of energy that our barely used fission fuel represents. In addition, those same or similar reactors can make new fuel from the uranium-238 that current reactors do not use, a process called breeding. The image shows the different uranium isotopes, different types of uranium, and how much of each of these we get when we mine this element. Our current nuclear plants use U-235, which is that little tiny sliver of green, but new reactors will be able to use the U-238, which is over 100 times more plentiful, and which is discarded today or used for military purposes. I would rather use it to make clean energy. And of course, we also have reactors that can breed fuel from thorium, large stockpiles of which we already have. This storage site in Nevada alone holds enough thorium to meet all of the U.S. energy needs for 10 years or more. No mining required. And finally, the extraction of uranium from seawater has been demonstrated successfully and could be commercialized if and when there's a market for more. Because uranium is constantly leached from the seabed into the ocean, it's safe to say that we will never run out of this. One thing that I found fascinating, and it's really important, is that, and it made a big difference to me, was realizing just how safe nuclear energy has been for us. Even counting the high-profile accidents that everyone knows about, the number of deaths per unit of energy produced is lower for nuclear energy than basically any other source of energy. I looked at the data on this chart, particularly in the red box, and I realized that we don't even think about the safety of all these non-nuclear energy sources, but we really should. I realized that the most dangerous nuclear plant is one that never gets built or is shut down prematurely. This is because that void today is filled with fossil fuel plants, burning stuff, and that kills people. So, my soup broth of faith, with some meaty thorium added, together with molten salt veggies, environmentalist seasoning, and climate change cabbage. That last one's an original. This is being heated up on a nuclear energy fire. And if I was going to have an aha moment, this is the time to have it. But really, I didn't. What I experienced was a gradual realization that these things were connected. I had my faith, and there were ideals and problems and solutions, and I was starting to realize that my faith and ideals were calling me to work on getting the solutions applied to the problems. I needed to turn into an activist. So here I am at the climate strike a few weeks ago. Today, I work with multiple pro-nuclear environmental NGOs. I volunteer for booth duty at conferences and street fests where the local American Nuclear Society chapter provides an opportunity to share information about the benefits of nuclear technology. I blog for fourthgeneration.energy. I spend a fair amount of time on Twitter, and I run the Atomic Illinois Facebook group. I'm joining lots of other environmentalists and riding a bus to Springfield on Tuesday for Clean Energy Lobby Day. And I'll hold up a nuclear sign and try to help people recognize the huge contribution that nuclear energy makes to our clean energy mix here in Illinois. And my activist mantra, save the nukes, build more nukes, and build these new nukes we've been talking about. Even with support of my friends and my family and my faith community here at St. Simon's, which is awesome, and my fellow activists, I'm not immune from feeling overwhelmed and ineffectual from time to time. The problems of climate change, ocean acidification, and energy poverty worldwide are so huge, it's not always easy to see a way through. But I have hope. Faith, science, and math are needed to solve our problems. I believe that our community of faith here in the Episcopal Church is and will continue to be at the forefront of this type of effort. Embracing science, math, and technology and history is important because those things are no less gifts from God than the natural world is. There's much we can do if we allow ourselves to responsibly use what's been given to us. With faith, ingenuity, persistence, determination, care, compassion, and humility, we can use these gifts to decarbonize our electric grids, to repower our industry with clean, non-emission energy sources, to transform our transportation, to not only reduce and eventually eliminate emissions, but also to provide everyone with reliable, comfortable ways to get where they need to go. Replace liquid fuels with synthetic carbon-neutral fuels manufactured using clean, affordable nuclear energy. And provide fresh water in drought-stricken areas through desalination powered by clean energy. Recycle everything. This is a very energy-intensive process. Give everyone in the world a chance to lead a productive life and reduce our impact on our amazing natural spaces and rewild them where we can to be enjoyed by generations to come. There are many more reasons that I like nuclear energy, but it all comes back to these two commandments. Love God, love our neighbors. What better way to love God than to use the gifts that God has given us to provide for each other, to lift each other out of poverty, to heal, and to care for God's creation. I'm still on this journey. I hope that you'll join me and come along, even if it's just for the ride. Thanks. But I didn't have to crouch too much.
No. Alan, so is the issue that people do not want these plants to be...
This will help it work with the video. Yeah. Thank you.
Is the issue that people do not want these plants to be built in their neighborhoods? Is that what is...
That's certainly part of it. NIMBY is, everything is NIMBY'd, right? So power lines are NIMBY'd, power plants of any sort typically are. People just don't like changes in their neighborhood, and particularly if they don't understand something. But yeah, but I would tell you that the people that live around the nuclear plants and work at them love them because they know that they're safe, because they know people that work there, or they do work there, and they know that it contributes a lot to the local community, and they understand it. So but that is part of the problem. Amy had a question too. Ms. Vicky.
She wanted to know what kind of plants
Right.
they had in France.
So Amy's question was, what kind of plants did France have, I think? And the plants in France are similar to the ones that we operate here. They're called light water reactors. In general, that's a broad category. And they use pressurized regular water to moderate and cool the core. And moderation is an important concept that we won't talk about here because it's, you could tell a geek joke about it, but you wouldn't really understand it if you didn't spend some time, looking at it. We don't have any French-designed plants here in the U.S., but we could, and they wouldn't really be much different than us. What they did is they standardized on a single one or two designs, when they did this. So this is called the Medsker plan, and like I said, in 1973, when the oil embargo happened, the prime minister at that point was a guy named Medsker, and he said, let's, we don't have oil, but we have brains, and we can figure this out. And what they figured out was that they could build the same nuclear plant over and over again. They have like 53 of them now, 53 reactors there, and it provides over 75% of their electricity. And they are the cleanest grid on the planet.
Alan?
Dave, yes.
Yeah, I seem to recall that maybe, 15 years ago or so, somebody told me there were no new nuclear plants on the drawing board. Was there a point where they just totally stopped building them?
Back in the 80s, yeah, that happened. There were some high-profile accidents that happened. 3 Mile Island was the first one, and that actually triggered a fair amount of extra work that the plants being built at that time had to do. Clinton here in Illinois was one of them. They were building it at the time. They had 2 reactors planned for that plant, and they had to do enough control room design, redesign, and other things as a result of what we learned from 3 Mile Island, that they actually ended up not building the second reactor. So more people died because of that, because more emissions happened, because fossil fuels are where it's at when it's not nuclear. But yeah, there are some on the board right now, but most of them are on hold. There's 2 reactors being built at an existing plant in Georgia at the Vogel site, and those will be finished in another couple of years, probably. There were 2 more of that same design being built in South Carolina, and that project was being run pretty badly, and it got halted and canceled. But it could be picked up by somebody else, and I hope that it is. Terry.
How many years worth of nuclear energy do we have in this way that you've described it?
Thousands. I mean, once we start using thorium, that's very common. And it's the way that we can use it will allow us to use all of it up. And so, we're probably never going to run out of that. Certainly not before we develop something else, fusion or something else. It'll be hundreds and hundreds of years at the very least. And then uranium is replenished into the seawater all the time. And we know how to extract it. It's expensive to do that right now, but nobody really cares because we don't need to do it. But we can certainly turn to that if we need to. And once we do that, that'll be an endless supply.
Alan, was the issue in Japan, was that the earthquake or the tsunami or a combination of both, and could it have been avoided?
So the Fukushima Daiichi plant, which is 4 reactors, was overwhelmed by the tidal wave. When the earthquake happened, all the reactors shut down like they are designed to do, and they were all shut down at the time that the tsunami hit. But they had diesel generators that we talked about a little bit that provide backup power to cool the plant for a couple of days at least, because there's residual heat that is very intense when you first stop a reactor, so you have to continue to cool that to cool that core. And they lost those generators because they were in the basement. So the easy answer is they could have had the diesel generators up high. The even better answer is that the seawall could have been built to the height that it was recommended they build it. Right up the coast at another nuclear plant, they did increase the size of the wall, and they did not have a problem at all there. In fact, they used that nuclear plant to shelter some people that got evacuated from devastated areas. So yeah, we learned from that. The Japanese learned from that, but the problem from Fukushima is that Japan decided they needed to shut all their nuclear down and be very, very careful about starting stuff up. And so they're importing lots of fossil fuels. They're burning stuff. and they're killing people because they're burning stuff, and they're adding CO2 to the atmosphere because they're burning stuff. They have a lot of nuclear reactors there, many of which could be restarted. I mean, that part of it is pretty sad. Here in the U.S., we took that situation, we analyzed it, and we made some changes to the reactor sites that we have to be able to deal with disasters that we can't imagine what they would be, right? So they have these flex facilities, they're called now, and they have basically equipment that you could use for any kind of thing that you might need. And some of that equipment can be airlifted to other sites, even if they're not nuclear disaster things, right? So those facilities are now in place. There's some venting changes that they made and that sort of thing. So we learned from that. But my sincere hope is that the fear of radiation will not keep Japan from starting up their nuclear plants again and building more, because I mean they don't have resources. They need that energy, and they're a very energy intense economy like we are. So it's Ed.
Very compelling presentation. Thank you.
Really excellent.
My question is, the GE Hitachi video was very interesting. Why isn't that being embraced and propagated?
They're looking for customers, basically. So that technology is ready to license. If it's, I don't think it's licensed already, but it's well into that process. These are big investments, and right now everybody thinks that everybody's against nuclear energy. Turns out that fewer than half people would actually say that they oppose it in some way, but people that are against it strongly have pretty loud voices, and they have big budgets.
They have pretty deep pockets too.
Yeah.
That has to be the largest problem with getting. Wouldn't you say is that those that would be in opposition to this are those that are invested in other energy sources?
Well,
big money players. You know,
to answer your question of who's anti-nuclear, so the people that like renewables a lot, and I go back and forth about that because I look at the math, and that's what I focus on emissions. What can we do that actually works to reduce emissions? And the renewables that we typically think about are wind and solar. They're intermittent, and we need something to back them up when they're not running, and something to meet the demand, when you don't get enough from them. And that is always a fossil fuel plant.
the land
Always.
space was fascinating to me.
Right.
The difference in land space.
Yeah, yeah. So nuclear is very energy dense. Energy density is a very key concept here. We didn't talk about it, but it's everything, all the benefits from nuclear energy come from that. Because you have 1,000,000 times more energy in a lump of uranium than you do in the same size lump of coal. 1,000,000 times. I mean, it's actually over 1,000,000. So it's just like 6 orders of magnitude more energy that you get from that. So it's just pretty awesome stuff. I will say that. I don't want to overstay my welcome, and I'm not sure when we are supposed to wrap this up. I'll take questions until the spaghetti dinner starts. Polly.
France being so successful, why hasn't it spread more in Europe? They're right next to Germany. And
Same reason that we have here is the fear of radiation. So Fukushima, the effects of that disaster, even though nobody was hurt by radiation at Fukushima, that's very key. 20,000 people died from tsunamis and earthquakes. Nobody died from those 3 of those 4 sites melted down. I mean, this is a very significant industrial accident. It's very expensive for TEPCO, the operator, and ultimately the government too. But it didn't hurt anybody. But the fear of nuclear, particularly in Europe, I mean, they lived in the shadow of Soviet nuclear weapons for decades and decades. And Chernobyl was they actually could measure radiation from the Chernobyl explosion that happened there. So that's, they are much more worried about it. France is they just announced that they're doing some initial planning to build 4 more reactors, 2 more plants of a new design, which is really good news. But Germany has said after Fukushima, they accelerated their plan to close all of their nuclear plants. And their emissions are like way up there. And if you look at electricitymap.org is a website that allows you to see real-time emissions of power sectors around the world, where they can get the data, they show that. And it's you can see it as it's happening. And France's grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour is how they measure that. And that's always the 2-digit number in France, like 34 or 50 or something like that. They've got nuclear and hydro with a little bit of wind. There's some wind too, which is recent. And Germany, if you look at them, they're building new coal plants. I mean, they have, and they're expanding this massive lignite, which is brown coal. It's like the worst kind of, it's like burning dirt, somebody told me once. The lignite mine, they've expanded it. They had to tear down an ancient forest. There was an old church that they demolished because the mine was taking it over. And the environmentalists were all out there, like, don't take the forest down, don't stop, leave it in the ground, right? And so some of my friends went out there and into the forest where they were like, chaining themselves to trees and things. And he said, so would you take nuclear energy so that we don't have to do this? And they're like, no. So it's very ingrained in in who they are over there. And that's a difficult thing to get past. It's a difficult thing to get past. So, in the end, nuclear will win, because in 200 years we'll be mostly powered by this type of technology. But in the meantime, if somebody tells you that we can do it on 100% renewables, then they haven't done the math. It's probably technically possible. It would be incredibly expensive, and it would still not really be even as reliable as the grid we have today. Fossil fuels are very reliable, and they've served us really well. We just now know that we have to stop burning them. I mean, right. I mean, it's right at this point, we know that we need to stop doing that, but we need to replace it with something else. If we took all the fossil fuels away today, civilization would crash. It would be chaos everywhere. So we don't need less energy, we need more energy, because there are billions of people in the world that don't even have an outlet they can plug into. And if we don't give them something good, they will burn coal. That's what they will do. And right now, the Russians and the Chinese are going to those countries, and they're saying, we'll build a nuclear plant for you. We'll give you the fuel, we'll take it back when it's used, we'll operate it for you, we'll finance it. We just want to be able to sell you the electricity. And they'll do that as a service, as a, whatever the model is called. The United States needs to get back into that game. There's a significant amount of foreign policy influence that we are going to lose. The Russians and Chinese are not going to build as good of a plant and run it as safely as we would. So, one of the things I say on Twitter a lot is, I'll see a tweet and I'll retweet it and I'll say, today's reminder that Russia is eating our nuclear lunch, or China, or both. Because if we're not careful, that's what will happen. So we do have lots of designs being worked on in the U.S. here. And we have to be able to get policy in place so that we can export those designs, and we could do that in a timely and not too costly way. Today's nuclear plants that we can build right now, that we know how to build, are perfectly good. They're totally awesome. That's one of the things I found out. Is I looked at this thorium stuff, and I'm like, let's do that. And I still say, let's do that. But the earliest we're going to see that is probably 2030. In the meantime, we have a lot of work to do. We have 80% of the world's energy is from burning stuff. 80%. That's a huge lift to replace. Huge. We need huge things to replace it. And it's not just electricity, it's all kinds of other stuff. So I would love to continue this. So maybe we'll figure out a way to do that sometime. Do another pick up with one or two concepts. If anybody has any ideas of what they'd like to learn more about or hear more about, let me know. You have the handouts. This presentation will be made available. I don't have a link for it on there because it's not up there yet. But thank you so much for being so gracious.